I've always considered myself a man of logic and reason. As a scientist, my life revolved around research and experiments, spending countless hours in the lab. My work was demanding, but I believed I had the perfect balance at home with my wife, Charlotte. She didn't work, opting to take care of the house, a role she seemed to embrace with enthusiasm. To ease her daily burdens, I hired a driver, Sean, to help with errands and drive Charlotte wherever she needed to go. Sean was a reliable guy in his early 30s with a calm demeanor that made him easy to trust. He had been with us for about a year, and during that time I never suspected anything out of the ordinary. Charlotte seemed content, always cheerful when I came home, and our life together appeared blissful. Charlotte and I had been married for 7 years, and in all that time I had never doubted her fidelity. Our routine was steady. I'd leave for the lab early in the morning and return late in the evening, greeted by Charlotte's warm smile and a well-prepared dinner. On weekends, we would often host friends, go for walks, or enjoy quiet evenings at home. It was a simple, peaceful life, one that I thought was built on mutual trust and love. One of my biggest blind spots was how I trusted too easily, thinking our life was perfect. I was wrapped up in my work, confident that my dedication and our comfortable lifestyle were enough to keep Charlotte happy. She had everything she could possibly want: a beautiful home, financial security, and the freedom to pursue her interests. I had always believed that if there were any issues, Charlotte would communicate them to me. She was my partner, my confidant, and I couldn't imagine her keeping anything significant from me. Little did I know, beneath this facade of domestic bliss, a storm was brewing, and my world was about to be turned upside down. Charlotte and Sean had struck up a friendship that I naively thought was purely platonic. She often mentioned how helpful and courteous he was, and I didn't think twice about it. Sean would drive her to the grocery store, her yoga classes, and even occasional lunches with friends. I saw this as a positive thing, believing it freed up more of Charlotte's time to relax and enjoy herself. Life continued its seemingly perfect course. My research was progressing well, and Charlotte appeared happier than ever. We had settled into a comfortable routine. I never questioned her outings with Sean, as she often shared details of her day, painting a picture of normalcy that kept my suspicions at bay. One afternoon, I decided to leave the lab earlier than usual. I wanted to surprise Charlotte with dinner at her favorite restaurant, thinking it would be a nice change from our routine and a chance to reconnect. I called her, but she didn't answer, which wasn't unusual if she was busy or out with friends. As I drove home, I noticed Sean's car parked at the end of our street, partially hidden by some trees. I found it odd, since he usually left after dropping Charlotte off. Curiosity piqued, I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I saw the car windows were slightly fogged up. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside, telling myself there must be a reasonable explanation. When I got close enough to see inside, my world shattered. There, in the back seat, was Charlotte, entangled with Sean in a passionate embrace. I felt a rush of anger and betrayal so intense that for a moment I couldn't move. My perfect life, my trusting nature, everything I had believed in, crumbled in an instant. I yanked the car door open, and they scrambled to cover themselves, shock and guilt plastered across their faces. "What the hell is going on here?" I shouted, my voice shaking with rage. Charlotte, instead of showing remorse, glared at me with a defiant look. "Why are you here?" she snapped, her tone dripping with annoyance rather than guilt. "Don't you have work to do?" Sean tried to speak, but I cut him off. "Get out," I commanded, my voice cold. "Both of you, now." Charlotte climbed out of the car, hastily adjusting her clothes. "You never have time for me," she hissed. "You're always at the lab. I needed someone who was actually there." Her words stung, but they only fueled my anger. "So this is how you deal with it? By cheating on me with the driver?" She rolled her eyes, her defiance only making me angrier. "Well, maybe if you paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have to." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had trusted, loved, and provided for was standing before me, blaming me for her infidelity. I stormed back to the house, my mind in turmoil. How could she do this to me? How could Sean betray my trust? They had quickly driven off after I caught them, disappearing down the street without a word. I had no idea where they went, but it didn't matter. My focus was now on what I needed to do next. I slammed the door behind me and went straight to the kitchen, needing to sit down and collect my thoughts. I sank into a chair at the dining table, staring blankly at the polished wood surface as the events of the past hour replayed in my mind. I considered the possibility of divorce, but it felt too simple, too clean. I wanted more than just a legal separation. I wanted retribution. I had loved Charlotte deeply, and her betrayal demanded more than just a lawyer's intervention. My mind raced with possibilities, each more devious than the last. Various reagents and compounds from my chemical laboratory floated through my thoughts. I had access to a range of substances that could cause discomfort or embarrassment without leaving lasting harm. I knew I needed to tread carefully. Any action I took had to be well planned and executed flawlessly. I couldn't afford to let my emotions cloud my judgment. The legal implications of any rash actions were too significant to ignore. I wanted revenge, but I also needed to ensure that Charlotte would face the consequences without giving her any leverage to counterattack in court. Charlotte had always been meticulous about her appearance, especially her skin. She invested heavily in skincare products and treatments, priding herself on her flawless complexion. The idea of using a compound that could cause severe acne struck me as the perfect revenge. It would hit her where it hurt the most, affecting her vanity and self-esteem without causing permanent harm. As I mulled over this option, an idea began to form. I had developed a compound in the lab meant to induce temporary skin irritations, initially intended for testing the efficacy of new skincare products. It was harmless in small doses, but would cause significant acne and blemishes for a few weeks. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the perfect solution. I could mix it into her skincare products or even her drinks, causing her to break out in severe acne. Just as I began to feel a sense of control over the situation, my phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from my boss, Dr. Reynolds. He rarely contacted me outside of work hours, so I knew it had to be important. I opened the message and felt a new wave of anxiety wash over me. Urgent. Need your presence at the lab immediately. Security breach reported. Potential loss of sensitive materials. I cursed under my breath. Of all the times for a security issue, it had to be now. I couldn't afford to ignore this. My career and the integrity of our research were on the line. I had no choice but to deal with this immediately, leaving my plans for revenge on hold. Reluctantly, I grabbed my keys and headed back to the lab, my mind still reeling from the betrayal and the sudden emergency. The unexpected turn of events had thrown a wrench in my plans, but I was determined not to let it derail me completely. I would handle the breach, and then I would focus on making Charlotte pay for what she had done. The wheels of revenge were already in motion, and nothing would stop me from seeing it through. I drove to the lab with a storm of emotions raging inside me. The betrayal I felt from Charlotte and Sean simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. But I had to focus. The message from Dr. Reynolds was serious, and I couldn't afford any distractions. When I arrived at the lab, I was greeted by chaos. Security personnel were everywhere, and my colleagues looked anxious and agitated. Dr. Reynolds spotted me and quickly approached. "Thank goodness you're here," he said, his expression grim. "Someone accessed our secure storage and took several vials of our new compound. We're still assessing the damage, but this could be a major setback." I nodded, trying to push thoughts of Charlotte and Sean to the back of my mind. "Do we know how they got in?" I asked, scanning the lab for any signs of forced entry. "Not yet," Dr. Reynolds replied. "We're reviewing the security footage now. In the meantime, I need you to help with the inventory and see if anything else is missing." I went to work, checking the shelves and cabinets meticulously. As I did, my thoughts drifted back to my plan for revenge. I needed to get that compound that would cause severe acne. I knew exactly where it was stored. After ensuring that nothing else was missing from my section, I made my way to the storage room where we kept the experimental compounds. The door was ajar, a clear sign of the breach. Inside, several vials were missing, but the one I needed was still there, tucked away in the corner of the shelf. I grabbed the small, unmarked jar and slipped it into my pocket. My heart raced, knowing that taking it was a risk. But I couldn't let this opportunity pass. I had to see my plan through. Back in the main lab, the security team had identified a suspect on the footage, one of our former interns who had been let go a few weeks earlier. It appeared he had somehow retained his access card and used it to break in. "We'll need to contact the authorities," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice tense. "This could turn into a legal matter." I nodded, my mind already drifting back to my personal crisis. "I'll finish up the inventory and then head home. Let me know if there's anything else you need." Dr. Reynolds gave me a grateful nod. "Thank you, your help is invaluable." I headed home. When I arrived home, the house was eerily quiet. The events of the day weighed heavily on my mind, but I felt a strange sense of calm. The compound was safely in my pocket, and my plan was ready to be set in motion. I walked into the kitchen where Charlotte was sitting at the dining table, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. "Matthew, can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, taking a seat across from her. My anger had simmered down, replaced by a cold resolve. I knew I had to play this carefully. Now it was a waiting game. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier," Charlotte began, her voice cracking. "I was angry and scared, and I lashed out. I shouldn't have blamed you for what I did." I watched her carefully, nodding as if I understood. "It's been a rough day," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I never expected this from you, Charlotte. I thought we were happy." Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached across the table to take my hand. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake, Sean. It just happened. I felt lonely and he was there, but it doesn't excuse what I did." I squeezed her hand, trying to appear sympathetic. "I understand, but it's going to take time for me to process this. We both need to work on this if we want to move forward." Charlotte nodded, relief washing over her face. "I want to make it right, Matthew. I'll do whatever it takes." I forced a smile, knowing that my plan was already in motion. "Let's take it one step at a time," I said. "We'll get through this together." "Well, since you're sorry, you can at least get me a beer from the refrigerator," I added, testing her willingness to please. She agreed and stood up, heading towards the kitchen. As soon as her back was turned, I quickly took the small vial from my pocket and poured the powder into her soup, stirring it just enough to mix it in without being obvious. Charlotte returned with the beer and sat down. I took a sip and nodded appreciatively. We ate in relative silence, the tension slowly dissipating. Charlotte seemed genuinely remorseful, and I played along, pretending to come to terms with my role in our problems. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of my revenge. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, watching a movie as if nothing had happened. Charlotte leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and for a moment it almost felt like old times. But I knew better. The effects of the compound would start to show in a few days. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Each morning I watched Charlotte closely, anticipating the first signs that the compound was taking effect. I went about my usual routine, heading to the lab early and returning late, all the while keeping an eye on her. Charlotte seemed genuinely committed to mending our relationship. She was more attentive, more affectionate, and more willing to talk about our issues. Her efforts would have touched me deeply if not for the knowledge of her betrayal lingering in my mind. At the lab, the investigation into the security breach continued. The former intern identified as the culprit had been apprehended. He claimed he acted alone, motivated by a grudge after being dismissed. Fortunately, the stolen materials were recovered before they could be sold or misused. The lab's security measures were being tightened, and while the situation was under control, the stress added another layer to my already tumultuous life. One afternoon, while walking through the lab, I passed by the storage room where we kept our compounds. I glanced at the shelf where I had taken the vial that night. My heart nearly stopped when I saw another bottle with the same characteristics sitting in the exact spot where I had taken the first one. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It was the same compound I had used for my plan against Charlotte. But that was impossible. I had taken the only sample, and I had been the only one working on it. No one else should have known about it, let alone had access to it. A wave of paranoia washed over me. Had someone discovered my plan? Was someone watching me? I quickly took the bottle and slipped it into my pocket. just as I had done with the first one. I couldn't afford to leave any evidence behind. Returning to my office, I tried to calm myself. I needed to think clearly. The discovery of the second vial raised questions I wasn't ready to face. Had I been careless, or was there something more sinister at play? Despite my efforts to focus on work, my thoughts kept drifting back to the bottle. Why was it there? Who could have placed it back? The unsettling possibilities gnawed at my mind. I needed to be more cautious. My plan for Charlotte was still in motion, but I couldn't afford any mistakes. As the days passed, I watched Charlotte for any signs of the compound's effects. Her skin remained clear and she seemed unaware of the looming consequences. Each day felt like a waiting game, filled with tension and uncertainty. At the same time, the authorities confirmed that the stolen compounds were intact and no longer a threat. The intern would face serious legal consequences, and the lab's reputation remained untarnished. It was a relief to have that crisis behind me, allowing me to focus entirely on my plan for Charlotte. A week and a half had passed, and I was beginning to feel frustrated. Despite my careful planning, Charlotte's skin remained clear and she seemed perfectly healthy. Each day I watched her closely, waiting for the first signs of the compound taking effect, but nothing happened. One evening, as we were sitting down for dinner, I decided to ask her directly. "How are you feeling, Charlotte? How's your skin? Any issues?" She looked at me with a puzzled expression. "I'm fine, Matthew. My skin is fine too. Why do you ask?" I shrugged, trying to seem casual. "Just wondering. You've been under a lot of stress lately." She nodded, smiling slightly. "I appreciate your concern, but really, I'm okay. I actually feel better these days." I forced a smile and nodded, but inside my frustration grew. How could the compound not be working? Had I miscalculated the dosage? As I pondered this, Charlotte suddenly rolled her eyes and slumped over unconscious. "Charlotte!" I shouted, rushing to her side. I frantically checked for a pulse and, finding it faint, called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived quickly and whisked her away to the hospital. I followed, my mind racing with fear and confusion. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Work was calm that day, so I allowed myself not to go in. Instead, I focused on Charlotte, praying she would be all right. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally approached me. "Mr. Matthews?" he asked, his expression somber. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Yes, that's me. How is she?" The doctor sighed. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. We found a lethal dose of cyanide in your wife's blood. Cyanide blocks oxygen from entering the bloodstream, which causes a loss of consciousness and ultimately death if not treated in time. From what we can tell, the cyanide had been in her system for quite some time, gradually blocking enough oxygen to cause her to collapse." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Cyanide? How could that be possible? "But how?" I stammered. "I don't understand." The doctor looked at me with sympathy. "Cyanide is tasteless, odorless, and colorless, much like some other compounds. It's possible it was ingested unknowingly. Unfortunately, by the time she lost consciousness, it was already too late. There wasn't enough time to save her." I sank into the chair, my mind reeling. The compound I used to cause acne was also tasteless, odorless, and colorless. But cyanide? That was something else entirely. My plan to make Charlotte suffer for her betrayal had taken a horrifying turn, and now she was dead. As the realization sank in, I felt a mix of horror and guilt. Charlotte's funeral was quick and somber, attended by a small circle of family and friends. Her parents were devastated, their grief compounded by shock when they learned that she had died from ingesting cyanide. As a chemist, I was an obvious suspect in their eyes. They looked at me with a mix of sorrow and suspicion, unable to believe that their daughter's death could be anything but a deliberate act. At first, I denied any involvement in her death even to myself. I tried to continue living as I had before. We had no children, so I was left alone in our once shared home. Without concrete evidence, the court ruled Charlotte's death an accident. No murder charges were filed against me, and I managed to avoid any legal repercussions. The lack of evidence worked in my favor, but guilt and paranoia haunted me. One afternoon, as I was working in the lab, the mother of my deceased wife, Eleanor, stormed in. She found me in the hall where everyone had access, her eyes blazing with fury. Before I could react, she began shouting, her voice echoing through the sterile corridors. "You killed her!" "I know it was you, Matthew," she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at me. My colleagues turned to look, their faces masks of confusion and concern. Just then, one of my lab partners, Dr. Stevens, approached us. He glanced at Eleanor and then at me, frowning. "Matthew," he said, "I need to talk to you about something. The bottle of cyanide we had in the storage. It's missing. You were the last one to access that section. Do you know where it is?" Eleanor's eyes widened in realization. "You see, he did it. He had access to the cyanide. He killed Charlotte." The tension in the room was palpable. I felt the walls closing in on me as Eleanor's accusations filled the air. My mind raced for a way out. The police had already ruled Charlotte's death an accident, but this new development could reopen the investigation. "Eleanor, you're grieving," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "I understand your pain, but I had nothing to do with Charlotte's death. The cyanide bottle must have been misplaced. I didn't take it." Dr. Stevens looked skeptical, but before he could press further, Eleanor pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'm calling the police. They need to know everything. You won't get away with this." A wave of panic washed over me. I couldn't let this escalate. If the police got involved again, they might uncover the truth. I had no intention of going to jail for what had happened, even if Charlotte's betrayal had driven me to it. "Eleanor, please," I pleaded, my voice shaky. "You need to calm down. This isn't helping anyone." But she ignored me, her voice steady as she spoke to the emergency operator. "Yes, I need to report a murder. My daughter was killed by her husband. He used cyanide, and he's right here." My colleagues watched in stunned silence as Eleanor made her accusations. I could see the doubt creeping into their eyes, the suspicion taking root. The police would be here soon, and I needed to think fast. My mind raced with possible defenses, ways to explain the missing cyanide and deflect blame. We were all taken to the police station, the tension palpable as we rode in silence. Eleanor sat next to me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. My colleagues were also there, confused and concerned about the accusations flying around. The police officers led us into separate rooms for interrogation. The questioning was relentless. The detectives were thorough, going over every detail of my relationship with Charlotte, my work at the lab, and the events leading up to her death. At first, I stuck to my story, denying any involvement. But the pressure was immense. The police, eager to close the case, pushed hard, exploiting every crack in my defenses. Hours turned into days as the interrogation continued. My mental state deteriorated under the constant barrage of questions and accusations. Eleanor's grief-stricken face haunted me, and my colleagues' betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. They wanted the truth, and the truth was becoming harder to deny. Finally, the weight of it all became too much. The lies, the guilt, and the relentless pressure broke me down. In a moment of despair, I confessed. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I did it. I poisoned Charlotte." The room fell silent. The detectives exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "You're admitting to killing your wife with cyanide?" I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and dread. "Yes, I used a compound from the lab. I didn't mean to kill her. It was supposed to cause acne, but something went wrong." They took my confession, every word recorded. The judge only needed my confession to pass a sentence. The search for further evidence and the full context of my actions were deemed secondary. Eleanor's face was a mixture of triumph and sorrow when she heard. My colleagues looked on, their expressions a blend of shock and pity. The trial was swift. My confession left little room for defense. I stood before the judge, my heart heavy with regret. As the judge read out the verdict, I couldn't help but think about the chain of events that had led me here. Charlotte's betrayal, my plan for revenge, and the unintended consequences that had spiraled out of control. Although the sentence had not yet been executed, I was placed under house arrest. Each day felt like an eternity as I awaited the inevitable knock on the door that would inform me of my final imprisonment. The day I was escorted back to my home under guard, I felt a strange sense that I still can't describe. This is how it all ended for me. Perhaps the divorce option that I so quickly disliked was quite good.